Today, we're diving into the gritty and gripping world of a soldier's life during the monumental Napoleonic Wars through the pages of The Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. This rare glimpse is penned by a real foot soldier, Jacob Walter, who marched with Napoleon himself. This is the third part. Let's get started. While I was working in various ways at my trade after the Prussian campaign, the war with Austria broke out in 1809, and I was called into the garrison at Stuttgart. My regiment and several others were already on the march to Schorndorf, and the route was to lead through Bavaria. On the way, however, a courier overtook us, bringing the command to march back to Stuttgart again the next day, and then we struck a route toward Tyrol through the Adlerberg territory. We came then through Heckingen, through the Killerthal, Saalgau, Altshausen, and then the monastery of Weingarten. There we were already meeting outposts of the enemy, but we still had good quarters and especially a lot of wine from the Lake of Constance. When the Tyrolean insurgents heard of a large army reinforced by the allied Baden and French forces, they retreated, and we moved forward on all sides. The army then went through Ravensburg and to Hofen on the Lake of Constance, while the enemy moved with several skirmishes to Lindau and finally back into the mountains. In Hofen, the Lilienberg regiment was also stationed, in which my brother served, and we met in his quarters. It is easy to imagine that we two brothers rejoiced heartily at our reunion. The worry of one of us about the possible misfortune of the other was so much greater because we could seldom see and never protect each other. After the aforesaid reunion, I had to go through Buchhorn to Lindau. This latter city lies on an island in the lake, and a wooden bridge leads into it. The insurgents had to move out of this city for fear of being shut in. The 1st Battalion of my regiment stayed 10 weeks in this city, in which French horsemen were also stationed. During this time, we had to make frequent attacks upon the enemy, among which the following were especially noteworthy. As I stood at my outpost with the picket near the bleaching meadow facing Bregenz, the enemy moved in over the vineyards. The outpost had to move back to the picket. The picket fired, but the enemy approached. While each soldier fired wherever he could take a position, everyone stationed himself behind the bleaching house and took up the defense. To be able to aim better, I ran into a bleaching hut built of boards which lay well forward. A staircase went up from the outside, and I stationed myself on this, resting my rifle on the railing, where I could take aim at every man who approached. During the time while I was firing 40 out of my 60 cartridges, the bullets kept raining down like hail upon my hut, and the enemy came too close upon me. Now I sprang down the steps and across the meadows back to the picket, which, however, was already retreating toward the city. Then I had to jump through gardens and hedges, and the enemy came to the gate just a little later than I did. I almost choked, gasping for breath. When all of us had retreated into the city, the enemy remained outside the city 3 days, firing continually. We, however, had erected a bridgehead, breastwork of sandbags, and a trench and defensive iron spikes. We fired through the loopholes and from the wall with cannon and small guns. During the heavy shelling, I shot a man in front of a garden house as he came a little way forward toward the breastwork and aimed into the loophole. But after I shot and he suddenly fell, several others wanted to carry off this dead man, as was often done. However, the more openly it was done, the more often other men were hit too. Finally, we fired with cannon, throwing projectiles into the large and beautiful garden houses, setting them all in flames. On the 3rd day, the enemy could no longer hold out because of the heavy artillery fire and moved back into the mountains. As soon as the road was cleared, the trees standing in the gardens were cut down by the thousands, along with the beautiful box hedges which stood there tall and beautiful like walls, and the rest of the buildings were completely torn down, so that they would not be a hindrance to the shelling anymore. This inflicted a damage of 1 million florins on the city. After a time, we again undertook a general attack for which the Lilienberg regiment, Baden and French soldiers, and the sharpshooters joined us. The enemy was attacked in front of Lindau and was driven in retreat back into the mountains. Before the attack, volunteers were called upon to advance by skirmishes, and I went with them. The number was 160 men in all, and we were under the command of a lieutenant. Under the continual firing, about 50 sharpshooters were cut off from us during the pursuit and led captive into the mountains. All of us volunteers pressed halfway up the mountain, which was 2 hours distant from Lindau, in order to recover the captives. When we saw that the columns advancing behind us were no longer following but were dividing in the middle, and that our detachment had moved 3/4 of an hour too far away, we heard the ring far to the left and far to the right, as though it came from Kempten and to the right from Bregenz. This seemed to be a turning of our men into retreat, which assumption proved to be true. Now the lieutenant wanted to retreat with us, but we all complained at that, and still wanted to bring back the captives from the mountains. The lieutenant would not give in, and we had to go back to a little village at the foot of the mountains. When we came into this village, we were fired upon from the houses and gardens, and our army had already retreated halfway toward Lindau. Everyone then had to rely upon his legs, and amid much firing we had to run until we almost choked for want of air. We met the whole corps in an oak wood a half-hour out of Lindau. Here we wanted to take a stand, but could not because of the danger of being surrounded by insurgents. Now the detachment retreated slowly until near the city, and then took up again the position for firing. Here we held out for half an hour, everyone firing as much as he could. The cannon were hauled out, but the grape-shot fire did not help either, since the enemy formed a half-moon line and only a few could be hit, for they lay down on the ground behind the hedges, trees, and hills, while every shot of theirs could hit our compressed column. Finally, too many of our men fell, and the enemy drew near the city gate in order to cut everyone off. This hurried our retreat into the city. Noteworthy was the state of the peasants who had to drive the wagons to pick up the wounded, and who had to come right along at the time of the attack. 4 men and 4 horses were hitched to each wagon. As soon as the firing began, they had to stay with us. From then on, none of them could be seen sitting upright on his horse. They were all lying down on their horses, and those on the wagons flung themselves down amidst a fearful howling. In addition, they were given blows because of their fear. During this time that I was at Lindau, the 2nd Battalion of the Francomont Regiment, which was stationed at Wangen and Isny, was made completely captive. Later peace was made and we marched into Bregenz, a town up on the Lake of Constance. However, the entrance into this city was looked upon as a somewhat hostile move. For the sake of security, several regiments coming from the mountains entered it from behind, and those from Lindau moved in from the front. Indeed, the regiment of Lilienberg had once before been forced to flee after a conquest of the town. It happened in this way. While the soldiers were looking about for booty in the cellars and houses, the enemy moved into the town and drove everyone out through the narrow pass in the mountain, which has 3 outlets. On this occasion, the enemy should have pressed their advantage. Rather than rushing dispersed into the attack, they might better have occupied the 3 outlets and made captives of everyone. Instead, they only fired down from the mountains at their fleeing enemies in the pass, not having occupied the outlets strongly enough. When our before-mentioned entry into Bregenz began, there was once more disorder among the soldiers. Cellars were broken into, and wine was carried out in buckets everywhere. Even several kegs were left running. Everyone became intoxicated until finally a strict order put an end to all this. We drank especially a great deal of very thick red Tyrolean wine, and we had everything in abundance. When, however, a new day arrived and all had moved into their quarters, everything became quiet, and the property of the citizens was safeguarded. I stayed there almost 3 weeks at the home of a chimney sweep, together with 9 other men, and we had everything, in particular as much as we could drink, wine and cherry brandy. After 3 weeks, my regiment was moved to Dornbirn, which was a large marketing center lying in the Rhine Valley between Switzerland and Tyrol. In this town, I came into the house of a furrier who himself was still with the insurgents. His wife had a little child about 3/4 of a year old. This child was remarkably beautiful, and I too had my fun with it. Once I gave this child some brandy to drink. Little by little the child took a liking to it, so that it became a bit intoxicated and so gleeful that I had to keep it from falling down from the pillow. This was great fun, and did not do the child any harm. I stayed another period of about 3 weeks in these quarters, and in the entire village the people were quite friendly. The householders in this village and the surrounding region have several maids who come from the Tyrolean Alps. These maids are especially remarkable for their dress. All their black skirts are of one piece with the bodice, and have a great number of pleats all around. Upon their heads they wear large black caps, which likewise have curious pleats, and are large and round like beehives in form. These maids have especially pretty and rosy-colored faces, which is said to come from eating milk and cheese. As to sociability, however, there is not much to say for them, since they are shy and not very talkative. They showed this even more toward orderly soldiers, as I know from experience, since there were 2 such maids in my house. It often happened, when they were sitting at their meal and I would joke with them decently, that they would jump up from the table and run out of the room, and then it was difficult to get them to come back again. Regarding the fertility of this region, there is not much rye or German wheat, so much the more corn, however. The bread in particular is usually of nothing but corn. When you look at the bread, you believe that it is made of the nest kernels. When eating it, however, you notice it is coarse, heavy, and soggy. Wood is not cheap either, and in place of it, in the entire Rhine Valley, they dig peat, that is, sod, which is a grayish red. This is cut and piled up, dried in the air and sun, and then burned in stoves instead of wood. During this time, from spring to fall, we always had the great snow-capped mountains before and later around us. Every time that it had rained, even in the greatest heat in August, one could see that the mountains were covered with new snow to a third of the distance down from the top. In the month of October, we again marched homeward, and the route led through Wangen, Ravensburg, Altdorf, and Waldsee, and from there to Biberach, where we all had to stay for some time, being quartered in the surrounding villages. I also was assigned to a village and to the house of a well-to-do peasant who had a sister, a nun who was living at home. Since I would read books frequently on certain days, and the nun noticed my behavior, she asked me why I always read and was so thoughtful. I said that my former circumstances gave me occasion to do that. Since I kept trying to be pleasant to her and was able to draw her attention more and more toward me, she asked others about my situation. Now I thought that since this thing had been started, it must be carried on. I spoke to all my comrades located in the village, saying that they should call me at times Miller, at other times Walter, and again Kapuziner. Again, this was done. Then the nun said to me, "Now I know indeed where your devout reading comes from. You may as well confess it to me." So then I did her the favor and told her that my brother had been a priest and I a Capuchin monk, that I had already vowed my chastity, and also that my name had been Miller instead of Walter, which the malicious soldiers always applied to me. I finally told her that she had evidence here in my beard, which I still wore on my chin. From now on, these pious hosts were very sympathetic toward me, and the nun told me her entire cloister story, and they had a liking for me above all other soldiers, so much so that the old father wept tears. Especially when I left, he wept with the others, begging that if I loved them, I should inform them of my future fate in distant places. They even wanted to accompany me for several hours. After the years 1810 and 1811 had passed by, and I was, in 1811, at the house of my godfather, Master Craftsman Haffele, the innkeeper at Ellwangen, war once more broke out. This concludes the 3rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Walter's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.